Hi all. This presentation is a presentation on evolution and natural selection. You are going to need to write down some different things. Some of them will be starred. Otherwise, I will tell you during this presentation what you should copy down. And if I don't tell you to copy it down, do not worry about it. You are going to want to do 2-column notes with the important information on the left, the big ideas on the left, and the supporting ideas on the right. I will point out how you're going to do this as we go along. So, to begin with, a lot of this story centers around this man, Charles Darwin. He is sometimes known as the father of evolution. He is the man who's credited with formulating initially the hypothesis of evolution, which has now become the theory of evolution. So we will be talking a lot about him throughout this presentation. Basically, what he came up with was the theory of evolution. Basically, what he believed was that evolution, or otherwise known as a change over time, is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. Just like you're a descendant of your parents and your great-grandparents, he believes that evolution is descent from one common ancestor of all living things down to the multitude of species that we have today. So that's what his idea of evolution is. Go ahead and hit pause and write this information. All right. So continuing on with what evolution is, it is the process by which populations and species change over time. Evolution assumes that all life came from one common ancestor, and after that one common ancestor, there was descent with modification. We've discussed the idea of a single-celled organism being the first life to crawl out of the primordial soup, and evolution has caused changes that have led to all of the species here on Earth. Go ahead and hit pause and write this. I want to remind you we did some activities to support this idea of what a theory is, but I want you to write this down as well. A scientific theory, if you remember, is a well-supported, testable explanation of phenomena that have occurred in the natural world. So in other words, a theory is a well-tested idea that has been tested multitude of times by many different scientists, and the results have all shown that that theory is in fact correct. So when we talk about a theory, it's a pretty big deal in science. Please write this information down. This will go on the right-hand side of your sheet, by the way. So, back to Darwin. Here's a picture of his boat that he sailed around the world in. It's the HMS Beagle. So keep that in mind as we talk about his journey. The voyage of the Beagle. It began February 12th, 1831. Darwin had been preparing to go the into seminary to become a Christian priest. And he was, however, approached before he did that by somebody telling him about the HMS Beagle and that it had been commissioned to go on an around the world trip with its main purpose being to map the coastline of South America. The ship again was the HMS Beagle. Darwin decided that he would put off going to seminary to become a priest until later on, and that he'd jump on this opportunity. The Beagle needed to have a naturalist who was somebody who would, at each stop that the Beagle made, he would look at the wildlife, the plant life, everything at each of those stops and describe those things for sailors who would come in the future. He took his job very seriously. Again, it was a destination of a voyage around the world. And from this voyage, he found evidence to propose a revolutionary hypothesis about how life changes over time. Don't worry about writing this. You're not going to write this either. But I want you to know that as Darwin went about his job on a daily basis, he really observed a lot about what was going on. As he visited different areas, lots of questions came to mind. He visited the countries of Argentina and Australia. They both had very similar grassland ecosystems. Those ecosystems were very similar as well to the ecosystems that he had back home in England. What he noticed, however, was that there were very different creatures living in each of those three different countries. Neither Argentina or Australia was home to the sorts of animals that lived in the European grasslands. And he wondered, why is it that there aren't any rabbits in Australia? Despite the presence of having habitats that seem perfect for them. Likewise, why aren't there any kangaroos in England? If there hadn't been a change over time, most of these animals should be the same from one place to another with the same kind of ecosystems. Darwin went on and he collected a lot of things. He was constantly tracking down small animals, large animals, different plant life, living organisms, as well as fossils. As he collected the preserved remains of fossils and ancient organisms, some of them resembled things that were alive today and that he was familiar with. However, others looked completely like anything he had ever seen before. As he studied the fossils, some questions came to mind. Why had so many of these different species disappeared, no longer around? Likewise, were they related to species that were alive today? These are questions that drove him further and further into his idea of evolution. Some ideas of what he saw, creatures like this that, again, really don't resemble what we have here today, but also some that are kind of like things that we've got here today. So, all of these things caused him to wonder. And then the fun really began. As he came around South America and mapped the western coast of the continent, they then sailed out further into the Pacific Ocean to a group of 13 small to medium-sized islands called the Galapagos Islands. They spent a lot of time there. There were big differences from one island to the next. The smaller islands, and the smallest ones, were really, really hot. They were dry. They were nearly devoid of any sorts of vegetation. There was vegetation, but not a lot. Hood Island was one of these. It had very, very sparse vegetation. He compared this to some of the bigger islands. The bigger islands had a lot more rainfall and a lot of different species of plants and animals that were there. This gave him a very unique setting in which he could study animals. In particular, Darwin was fascinated by two different species that he saw, the land tortoises and the marine iguanas. The tortoises really intrigued him because they varied in predictable ways from one island to the next. Basically, it came down to the shape of the tortoise's shell. It could be used to identify which island a particular tortoise inhabited or lived on. So these are the three tortoises that he saw. He saw, starting with this one, saddleback shelled tortoises. These guys have a special shape to their shell that allowed them to crane their necks up and eat the vegetation off of bushes and things like that. This was one of the smaller islands, so there wasn't a lot of vegetation, and the only food he could eat was up higher on bushes. So over time, the saddleback tortoise developed this shell with a indentation that allowed him to crane his neck. The opposite of this was on the big islands, the dome-shaped shell. This tortoise had a traditionally shaped shell that would not allow him to crane his neck up to eat higher vegetation. Most of his food or her food was on the ground. So it did not have the need to have to reach up. Then there was a third type, the intermediate shell. This tortoise was able to reach up a little bit, but also be able to comfortably eat close to the ground. Each of these shells developed or evolved over time to fit the needs of those particular tortoises. Again, this intrigued Darwin to no end, and he wrote everything down. Beyond the land tortoises, he also found finches that he really enjoyed studying. The blue-footed booby, which is a seabird with very blue feet. And finally, again, marine iguanas. So here are some pictures of the animals. As you can see, there's definitely a lot of things to be curious about. We've talked about the tortoises. Darwin loved the birds. He found that just like the tortoises on different islands, different birds had different shaped beaks from one another, from the same species, from island to island. And these beak shapes depended on what the major food source was. So he was able to get a lot of data from studying them. Again, he was very interested in the blue-footed booby. Blue does not naturally happen in animals very often, and this was something that evolved over time. So he was very interested in this. And the marine iguanas are the only iguanas that swim, and they actually eat the algae on rocks under the water. And they have evolved over time, the ability to get rid of excess sweat through sweating it out through their pores. I'm sorry, extra salt through sweating it out through their pores. This is the end of this recording.